Hello everybody, Jackie Codes here, and I promised you in a video that I would show you how to use these loot tables because I can assure you that this is a game dev game changer. The most basic use case for this is loot dropping. So it could be either by opening a chest, the type of loot you get, it could be the drops that an enemy or a boss gives you. So for instance, here is a chest, and if we get loot, we'll see that we get 2 basic and 1 uncommon item. If I keep going, you'll see basic is the most probable, but if I keep getting loot, we got something rare, and another rare one, I keep passing it. Rare, 2 rare ones in the last one. Oh! There we go. There was an Omega item that we got. So that is the most rare item we can get. I created a little script that gives 1,000 items and it counts the size of the array. It appends it. And if we scroll up here, we'll see that out of 1,000 items, we got 1,987 basic items, 887 uncommon items, 104 rare items, and 22 Omega items. And if we come in here, you'll see that each item has a probability. So the basic has 10, uncommon 5, rare 0.5, omega 0.1. And you'll see that these items, they're all inheriting from this loot object class, which has a probability. Unique, so for instance, maybe there can only be one item that can be in the game. It will only drop it once. Then always, if let's say you have a boss and he always is going to drop his golden necklace, then you could put always and it will always be in there. And then enabled. Sometimes you want to enable or disable certain items. So that is the loot object. So if we go to our weapons, you'll see that it is an item, but it also has this loot. So let's go to the item class quickly. So we can take a look at that really quick. And you'll see that the item class extends loot object, and it is an item. It has a name, a description, and a texture, which we have seen. Okay, so whenever I click this loot button here, you see that it is connected to this get loot function. So what it's doing is we have this chest loot table, and you'll see that it is a loot object. That is actually a mistake. It should be a loot table. The reason why this is working is because loot table inherits from loot object, but that was a typo. All right, so this loot chest table, if we go in on that, and here is instantiation of that loot table, you'll see that there is an item drop count. So this chest is going to drop 3 items. And you'll see that the table also can have this loot object, because maybe before you choose the loot, you could actually have different loot tables that you can choose from. So let's say you could have a super rare loot table and a mediocre loot table. You can mess around with that as you wish. So let's look at this loot table object class, whatever. So it has... We're going to go over the code step by step so you can see how this works. But it has an item drop count. That's what we see here. It has an item list. So these are all the items that it could potentially drop. We have all our items in there. Unique drops. So this is a global variable that needs to keep track of which items are unique, because it wants to keep track, add it to the array, and then when it's going over the loot again, it needs to make sure that it does not add that item again. This RNG heavily simplifies the code. This code is based off of this article. It's in C#, so I converted it from C# to GDScript. And shout out to Groud, who was in my stream when I was setting this up, and he told me about this RNG class. And yeah, you'll see later on that it makes it very easy. So you could see we are using a getter to generate the result. And if you're like me, before I learned how to use getters, I was terrified of them, but don't worry. I will try to explain this as simple as possible so that it does not scare you away. All it's doing is basically, you see in this loot table, we have this variable called item results. And when we grab that variable, you could see here, chest loot table, we're grabbing that item results table. it is basically performing all of those functions. Whoops. It is basically performing this whole function and returning this variable, and that's all the getter is doing. And all you need to do is, try to get this variable, and it will do all this logic and return it. Alrighty, I've left some comments. So if you want access to the source code for this project of this loot table, it is there on my Patreon. You could grab it there, but it's okay. I'm going to explain everything step by step in this video. But here I am. We're going to start off on a blank project. All I have in here is my image file of all our items. So first things first, let's create just a base scene where we can test. Let's do loot test. Okay, sure, we'll save it in the main thing, who cares. This is where we're gonna test out the code. So we'll also make a script with it. All right, so now let's generate our items. So before we make an item resource, what we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna make the loot item resource. So I'm gonna make a new folder and I'll call this loot logic. And in it, we are gonna create a new script. So this is going to be for our loot object. So let's open that loot object script. And it's not going to extend node. We are going to extend a resource because this is something we are going to instantiate as a resource. And the class name is going to be loot object. So to start off, we want to have some variables exported. So we're going to export probabilities, which is going to be a float. We're going to export var unique, which is a bool. Export always, which is a bool. And then we are going to export var enabled, which is a bool. And for now, I'll just set the default value to true. All right. Now we want to instantiate, we want to create our item class. So we'll do capital item. Let's open up that script, and we're going to extend our loot object class because our items should have all those properties. And we'll call this item. So our item is going to have an item name. You can't use name here because that is that will override an already declared name in some base classes. So we're going to have item name, and you could put description, but we don't need it for this. So I'll just go straight to texture, and it is going to be a text 2D. Great. So now we want to make all of our items. To make our life easier, this is just an item sheet PNG, and what I'm going to do is we're going to create an atlas texture, and this is going to be items atlas, and we are going to put in the atlas this and make unique. It just makes it a little bit easier to use. So let's create a new folder, instantiated items. Just makes it a little easier to have all of our items in one folder. So now we want to let's create a couple items. So we want to create items. We'll do this. I'll create basic, let's create it like this, basic boots. So if we see here, I have created a new resource, basic boots, and it extends items. So we have the item name and the item texture. And since item extends loot object, we have all of those loot object properties we have declared. So we're going to call this basic boots, and we can just drag in our atlas in there and edit region. Let's put the basic boots in there. Great. So since we have said that in my last example, the basic class had a probability of 10, we don't need unique, we don't need always, we'll just leave that be. Let's, I'm going to duplicate this and I'll put uncommon boots. And if we come in here, I could just change this to uncommon and then come in here and do the uncommon and change this to 5. So we need to make sure, as you can see, we overrode the picture for the boots. So the way you want to change that is before you change the texture, you got to make sure that you have this make unique. So now when I change it, it isn't going to change the other thing. And another way you could do that is before you duplicate it, you got to make sure that it is unique. So now we can duplicate it. Let's do rare boots. And if I change this, since we duplicated it, it was already unique, it should not change the uncommon one. Great. So now we have rare boots. And we could put 1.0. And now we can have omega boots. Let's come here. Let's do that. And good. Just make sure you're not overriding the things. Make sure you have the proper naming. And I'm going to do 0.1 for the omega boots. Nice. So feel free to pause the video and to generate as many items as possible. I'm going to do a couple more. I will speed it up. Alrighty, I did 8. I think that's enough for now. Alright, so now we need to make our next thing, which is the loot table. And if we come in here, it is going to inherit from loot object, and the class name is going to be loot table. Alrighty, so the first thing we want in this loot table is it's going to have an item drop list. We'll do first actually item drop count. That's how many items you want dropped from this loot table. And then the item drop list, which is going to be an array. Let's make some more space here. It's going to be an array of loot objects. Then we want our global array of unique drops, so we could keep track of that. That is going to be an array of loot object, and it'll be empty. And then we want to get access to the random number generator. And then we want to set up our item result, which is going to be an array of loot object. And remember, this is where we are actually doing the getter thing, and this is where we're going to return. So let's create the variable. We're going to create the variable item results array, which is going to be of type, it has to be the same type as this, because this is what we're going to be returning. We'll make it empty at the beginning, but in order to get rid of these warnings, we're just going to put return item results array. So, just to understand what this getter is doing, what I can do, let's just put this basic boots in here. Let's just do item results array, append these basic boots, because remember this is a loot object, and then return that. So how this getter works, let's go to our loot test. Whatever, let's just get rid of that. And let's create this loot table. So I'm going to create a new folder, instantiations, kind of like what we did in the item thing. We're going to create a script. Actually, not a script, sorry. We're going to create a resource. It's going to be a loot table, and we'll call this chest loot table. And remember what we said in the chest loot table. We want an item drop count of 1. And this doesn't matter. We haven't done any logic here, so you could put whatever you want. It really doesn't matter. This doesn't matter. We haven't done any logic. But if we export var loot table of type loot table, and then we put a ready function, and in here we insert our loot table. Just to see what this getter is doing, we're doing the most basic thing of returning that object with the basic boots. We'll do var loot equals loot table item results, and let's just print the loot. It should just be those basic boots. So you could see there is an array of one resource, and we know that this resource is the basic boot. So let's, we could say array of loot object. so that we can get, and you could see it, since we did this, it knows that this is a loot object. Let's just put an array. We know that this is an item, and we know that it has an item name. So let's just print it, and it'll print basic boots. There we go. That is just for testing, just so you see that how this getter works. It's just doing what we're saying and returning what we want to return. That's all the getter is doing. But we don't want to do that per se. We want to do some other logic. We want to use our item drop count. We want to take into account this item drop list, and we can delete this. And yeah, we want to return some loot. All right, so before we do all of our random logic, before we take into account the probabilities, we need to first deal with these loot object items that are always on. So that's what we need to do in the beginning. The ones that are always, we need to put them in this item results array first. So we'll create an array, always counts array. We'll make it empty. And we are going to cycle through. If you want to just take a moment, pause, what do you think we're going to cycle through? Like which array? We have some arrays up here. Which one do you think we're going to cycle through to see which ones are always that we need to add here? So you could pause the video and think about it. So yeah, it's going to be this item drop list. This is what we're going to cycle through. We'll do for item, and we know that this is going to be a loot object. For item in item drop list, we're going to check if the item is always and the item is enabled, because remember, maybe the item could be always, but maybe it's disabled. So we just want to check that it's also enabled. We are going to append the item to this. And we also want to add it to this item result array. So there's another function we're going to add here that's going to check and verify that it can be added. You know, it's going to check the unique drops and everything. So we're going to send this off to a new function, add to result. And this function is going to take this item results array, which is an array of loot object, and it's going to take the potentially added item, because this might not be added. Just because it goes through here, it doesn't mean it's going to be added. We need to check to see if we want to add it. So first and foremost, we want to check if the potentially added item is not unique, or if unique drops has potentially added item. So what this means here, so if it's not unique, then you can go through. But if it is unique, but it's not in this unique drops, because this is just checking, does the unique drop have this potentially item, or does it not have it? Because if it does have it, then we don't want to go in here. We don't want to add it, you know? So that's why there's an or. So if the potentially added item is unique, then we want to add it to unique drops. So append the potentially added item, and then we could say if potentially added item does not equal null. So if the potentially added item is a loot table, even though we're saying that it's a loot object, remember loot table inherits from loot object, we want to item results array, we want to append the whole array. This means that this potentially added item has a bunch of item potentially added item results. That means it would have item results. Don't worry about this. We're not really going over this much in this tutorial, but if it is a loot table, we want to append all of its item results to this. Else, item results array, append potentially added item. So yeah, there's a difference. This is if you're appending a whole array to an array, it just like merges two arrays together. And this is just if you're appending one item to an array, but this is generally what we're doing. I'm just keeping this for here for people who are interested in also having loot tables as loot. All right, cool. So now that we did this, what we're going to do is, after we append it to the always count array, we are going to put this item results array in here and this potentially added item. Think about what variable will be here. It is going to be this item. Cool, so now we have this always count array. And the reason why is because we want to compare it to this item drop count in the future. So that's what we're going to do. So let's get the var. We're going to get an integer, always count size equals the always count array size. So let's say we have like 2 items that we're always counting. This would be 2. And now we want the real drop count. That's going to be subtracting our item drop count minus our always count size. So if our real drop count is greater than 0, because like let's say maybe we're dropping 3 and there was 3 items that we always count, then we don't really need to do anything. Then we're done. We can just return this. But if it's greater than 0, if we have more items we can drop, we're going to create an array of droppables. And then for loot item in item list, in item drop list, if the loot item is enabled and the loot item always, not always, because we've already counted those, and unique drops has loot item, but we want doesn't have the loot item. So if it's not already in the unique drops, then we want to append it to droppables. So now this droppables, it has all the items that we're looking at. We got rid of all the items we don't care about. This is just the pure array of what we want to look at. In order to take into account the weights, remember we have like 10 for basic, 5 for uncommon, 1 for rare, 0.1 for omega. What we need to do is we need to extract the weights from this array. So we're going to loop through this droppable. So we're going to create first droppable weight, which is going to be an array. And it's going to basically match each item with its weights. So for loot object, and I just want to change the variables. I don't want to use the same ones. In droppables, what we're going to do is we're going to simply append. We're going to append in this droppable weight the loot object probability. Yes. So now we have this droppable array and we have this droppable weight, which is just matching that. And if we look, it'll make more sense if we come here and we look at rand weighted. Okay, you see? So we have this you see that we have an array of just strings. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we have the weights, which is matching each number. So 1 is 0.5, 2 is 1, 3 is 1, 4 is 2. So I'm going to ask a question. You could pause the video to answer it. Which string in this array has the highest probability of dropping or of being selected in this array? All right, unpause the video. I'm going to give the answer. So 4 has the highest probability because the weight is the highest. And you see down here, it is more likely to print 4 and less likely to print 1 because 1 has the smallest weight. And you see Godot gives us this amazing function, RNG, using that RNG, rand weighted, and you see it takes into account this weight array and it uses our, it's just getting something in our array and taking into account this rand weighted array. And it's an amazing function that heavily lowers the complexity of this system. So that's what we're going to do. So for I in real drop count, because remember, this real drop count took into account, it subtracted the items we're always counting. So always real drop count. we're going to create a variable hit. And remember, hit is equal to droppables. So in this droppables array we are doing this RNG, rand weighted, and we're going to put our droppable weights in there. And now it's just going to give us one of those items in the droppable, taking into account its weight. So this is going to be a loot object. And we are going to add to result this, first of all, our item results array. This is what we're returning at the end, and the item that we're potentially adding. And what we're going to do is we're going to find the index because we want to get rid of it from the droppables. So for we need to find this index. So var index is equal to droppables find. This is an array function. And what are we finding? This value. And so this is going to return an index. But if the index is equal to -1, that means it didn't find anything. So we just want to say if it does not equal -1, then, so this means if we're in this, that means it found something. We want to delete it from droppables and delete it from droppable weight. So droppables remove at index and droppable weight remove at index. So there we go. So it's gonna do this, remember, for however many times we need to count, and then it will return this. So let's test it out. That should be all we got to do. But first we need to come back to our loots chest and make it a little bit better. Let's drop 2 items. And how many items did you make? You'll make that the size of the array. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Just going to put 8. Put the basic boots. Omega. It really doesn't matter what order you put this in. There we go. So if we come in here, you'll see that this is updated. We exported our loot table. And we're getting our item results. So let's set up a quick button to test this. Let's just do a button. Whatever, test. Just put the button here. The button has a press signal. If we pressed it, we want to connect to get loot. And we will create this function. And when we get the loot, all we want to do is what we were doing here, which is getting our loot table and getting the item results. So the getter will return it in here. And then what we can do is for, and this is no longer just, so this is, we'll say loot array. So for loot in loot array, we want to print the loot item name. This is just for testing purposes. So now when I press this, there is an error. Great. It's okay. So for loot object and probability, it's saying that this invalid access probability, this loot object and droppables probability. Did I spell it wrong? Yeah. So I had a different spelling for that. It's probabilities. That wouldn't have happened if I would have done this loot object. That's what happens sometimes. Some typos. Oh, okay. We got another. Oh, does not like that. Okay. I did a mistake here. I appended droppables when I should have appended loot item. Yep. Typo there. It happens. All right. Let's try it again. There we go. So as we test, we got basic boots. We got uncommon. Let's see if we can get a rare. Boom. We got rare boots. Let's see if we can get omega. We got another rare. Uncommon. The omega. There we go. There's omega. I added something that was not in the article, and it makes life a lot easier. especially with testing the values and tinkering with it, we're going to go into our loot object and we're going to create an enum that's called rarities. And it's going to be basic, uncommon, rare, and omega. Var rarity is going to take of type rarities. And I'm going to not expose this probability because it's very annoying to put the probabilities each time. We are going to export rarities. So now if we go to basic, the default value is basic. But when we go to omega, we're going to put omega. And then rare, we're going to put rare. It's just much easier than, you know, typing in the numbers. And what's bad about typing in the numbers is when you end up changing those numbers, you need to change it for each item. And then what we're going to do is we are going to make a function in here called setup. And it is going to match the rarity variable. And we're going to put all the rarities here. So basic. And it is going to change the probability number. And this is where you can change all the things. So if it's basic, it's this. If it's uncommon, it's 5. If it's rare, it's 1. And if it's omega, it's 0.1. But we need to call this function in the loot table. So in the loot table, before we do anything, we're going to have a function called init objects. And what we're going to do, so we're adding a new function to here, init objects for item, which is going to be a loot object in item drop list. Let me make sure that's the right one. Item drop list. Yeah, that's what we're exporting. These are all the items in here. We are going to set up that item with the right loot things. And that way, now if I want to change the probability of, let's say, omega, let's make omega super probable now. Let's do 15. So now it should show up way more than the basic. And you see that there is a basic helmet and an omega helmet. Yeah, omega is coming up way more often now, and you can just adjust the values way more easier that way. And that is my contribution to this. But yeah, guys, this was a long tutorial, but I think this is super important. So you not only can you use this for getting loot and items, you could use it instead of having an item that inherits loot object. I had projectiles that inherited loot object. And so I used this in my boss fight where the boss, every time it chose an attack, there were some attacks that were more rarer than others that it would choose. So the possibilities of these are endless. And it's really amazing. You could apply this to many different systems. But yeah, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to support the channel, I do have a Udemy course you could check out. I also have a Patreon. I'll have the source code up there on the Patreon. But thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I'll catch you guys next time. See you later. Special thanks to all the Patreons who support the channel. You guys are awesome.